are up.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Popular Music Books in Process. The series is a joint project of the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. I should say that this year's POP Conference is finally starting next week online and continuing for 2 more weeks on Wednesdays and Thursdays. So go check out the schedule on the MoPOP site and or get working on your talks. So in this series last week, we featured Maria Sherman and Tamar Herman talking about boy bands and K-pop. And you can catch up on that session and all our previous sessions on our co-organizer Eric Weisbard's YouTube channel if you missed it. And next week, we're excited to be joined by Alex Ross discussing his new book on Wagner to stretch the definition of popular music a tad. But this week, we're talking about George Harrison on George Harrison, Interviews and Encounters, a new book edited by Ashley Kahn and published this summer by Chicago Review Press. Ashley is being joined today as moderator by Holly George Warren, as well as 2 contributors to the collection, Anthony DeCurtis and Mark Rowland. And after they present, we'll have a question and answer session that'll be moderated by our co-organizer, Kimberly Mack. As the session goes on, put your questions in the chat window, and Kim will use them to call upon you at the end. And of course, you can also have your comments and side conversations in the chat as well. So I'm just going to introduce Holly, who will take over moderating, and then we'll get going. Holly George Warren is a 2-time Grammy nominee and the award-winning author of 16 books, including biographies of Janis Joplin, Alex Chilton, and Gene Autry. She's written for myriad newspapers and magazines, been a producer on several music documentary films, and she teaches at the State University of New York at New Paltz. And take it away, Holly.
Thank you, Carl. It's great to be here. Thanks to Carl, Eric, Kim for pulling this incredible thing together. And I just want to get going right quick because I know there's going to be a lot of questions at the end, and we have some great comments from our 3 participants today. We are going to be talking about this fabulous book that Ashley Kahn has edited, and he's going to be telling us about it. I'm just going to quickly read their bios just to remind you who we are going to be blessed with their today. Grammy-winning author Ashley Kahn has received widespread critical acclaim for A Love Supreme, the making of John Coltrane's signature album, and Kind of Blue, the making of the Miles Davis masterpiece. His other books include The House That Train Built and is co-writer The Universal Tone, Carlos Santana's autobiography. Ashley teaches at NYU, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and other publications. So, yay, Ashley. Also, we're going to have 2 contributors to this wonderful book, including my longtime compadre who taught me how to write and edit and everything else that I know how to do, Anthony DeCurtis, who you probably know as a noted music journalist, critic, biographer, and educator, best known for his years on the masthead of Rolling Stone and contributing to such publications as the New York Times, Relics, and others. His career straddles the worlds of journalism and academia. He holds a PhD in American literature and is a senior lecturer in the University at Pennsylvania's creative writing program. Anthony remains a contributing editor at Rolling Stone and has authored and edited a number of books, including anthologies of his own writing, a collaboration on Clive Davis's autobiography, The Soundtrack of My Life, and one of my favorites, the recent biography, Lou Reed, A Life, which was a huge help to me when I was trying to write a book about Janis Joplin. Believe it or not, they have a lot of similarities. Weird. And also, we're excited to have Mark Rowland here today. Mark spent a decade as executive editor of Musician magazine in the late 80s and 90s and wrote narrations for the best-selling multimedia books And the Crowd Goes Wild and We Interrupt This Broadcast. Turning his skills to television, he became co-executive producer of TV One's award-winning music documentary series Unsung, and he served as chief writer and supervising producer of BET's documentary crime series American Gangster. To date, he has produced and written over 100 one-hour episodes of documentary programs for TV for such acclaimed series as Beyond the Glory, History Channel's Modern Marvels, ESPN's Sports Century, and VH1's Behind the Music. So welcome to Mark. So let's hear a little bit first off from Ashley about this very different kind of book project. We've heard some wonderful academic authors who have done a lot of critical analysis of their subjects. And here we have a book which is almost entirely in the words of its subject, George Harrison. Ashley, please tell us a little bit about the idea behind your book and how you pulled this together.
Thanks, Holly, and thank you to everyone for being here. Just wanted to, tell you how special it feels to be able to bring this book, onto this into this forum and to share it with you guys because, we're all colleagues and we're all looking at the music in the same sort of way. And speaking of what Holly just said, I mean, you really hit the nail on the head about, wanting to kind of be anti-analytical and pull away the various filters through which music personages, musical legends are seen, and allow George to speak for himself. I was blessed with someone who did a lot of talking. For someone who was known as the quiet Beatle, he was very unquiet through his career. And he was also incredibly authentic. There's this kind of struggle, this tension that you can feel even when he's in his early 20s and doing these Beatles interviews where he's done with the hype. He just doesn't want to deliver anything but getting to the essence and the truth, in what he's talking about. And one of the things that I think comes out in this book is the way that the rest of the world kind of catches up with George through his career. There's almost 40 years worth of George speaking, from the age of 19 until he passed away in 2001. And, you can kind of measure the way that the world grew up, and the role of music journalism and music analysis and, cultural studies, et cetera, caught up with thinking of music as having this deeper, more substantial role in the way we looked at the world. And of course, George was there to kind of lead the way in these interviews. So the process was to try and get to George's words as much as possible. And I'm really, really pleased that the two other gentlemen who participated in this book by allowing me access to the original tapes of their recordings, the raw audio. So thanks to Mark and to Anthony for allowing me to do that from 87, from a Rolling Stone interview. There were actually two long interviews that Anthony did with George in that year and with Mark in 89. That was kind of the intention of the book, is to remove the frame. Of course, every interview, every discussion, every conversation, and there are a few speeches and letters in there too from George that's in the book. There's over 45, is preceded by little contextual framing to understand where we are in the Beatles timeline or George's timeline afterwards, and what the historical, what was going on with, that particular interview, why the interview took place, and sometimes with commentary from the interviewers themselves.
So Ashley, do you want to kind of set the scene a little bit? I think you and Eric have gotten your heads together, and we're going to get to see a little clip that shows George around the time that both Anthony and Mark interviewed him. This is from 1988, when he was at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction of the Beatles.
Yeah.
Ashley, do you want to set this up a little further?
Sure. Both Holly and I work with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame every year, and that's kind of it's an ongoing thing. But when the Beatles were inducted, very much at the start of the establishment of the Rock Hall of Fame, there wasn't even a building yet for the Rock Hall of Fame. It didn't exist in Cleveland yet. There was a couple of things going on in '88. And what I love about this interview, and there are many YouTube, interviews with George speaking publicly that we could have chosen. But what I love about this is that he's dealing with two very personal crises at that point. One was the ongoing kind of mourning of John Lennon's death from 1980. And how poignantly he feels the loss when the Beatles are inducted into the Rock Hall. And then at the same time, Paul doesn't show up. And so the kind of legal tussles that were still going on between the individual members, kind of took its toll on Paul, and he decides not to show up. So this idea of George being very kind of naked and raw, in public, in the spotlight, really comes through in this interview. And yet there's this level of wanting to get a, meaning. And at the same time, he's got Ringo on the side. And Ringo, of course, is Ringo. So I'll leave that's the setup I'll do, and we'll let it roll.
Say much because I'm the quiet Beatle. It's unfortunate Paul's not here because he was the one who had the speech in his pocket.
And why didn't they play Octopus's Garden? We'll talk about that later.
Anyway, we all know why John can't be here, and I'm sure he would be, and it's hard really to stand here supposedly representing the Beatles. It's what's left, I'm afraid. But we all loved him so much, and we all love Paul very much. I suppose basically the reason we became a band was all the other people who were in the Hall of Fame already, including Leadbelly, because actually they stole his tunes, turned it into skiffle, and we all became skifflers when we were 13. And all of them in there. And all the people inducted tonight too, they all had great influence on us. And it was for that reason alone, we just wanted to get guitars, get in a band, because we didn't really have proper jobs at the time. Anyway, it sort of turned out fine, and it's got a bit bigger than any of us expected. And it's certainly wonderful to be here, and certainly a thrill. And thank you all very much, especially all the rock and rollers, the little Richard there. If it wasn't, it's all his fault, really.
Muhammad Ali.
Okay. So I think we can cut it, right? Yeah, is that it?
Don't forget Muhammad Ali, he picked us up in Miami Beach one day. Anyway, thank you all very much. And on behalf of John, I'm sure he's well covered here with Yoko, Sean, and Julian. And thank you all very much. God bless.
Yay.
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 It's interesting. One thing, Ashley, that really comes through in the book, and especially with the interviews that we're going to hear more about in just a second from Anthony and Mark, is George really did have this great sense of humor, and he had these, just rereading the interviews that that Anthony and Mark did with them, so many great fun little quotes and like just little funny comments that he made. So let's go first to Anthony, because Anthony spoke to him first in I believe it was the summer of '87. Anthony, what was it like meeting with him? You did 2 lengthy interviews with him. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that and how you approached it and what George was like, where he was in his life at that point?
Yeah, it was astonishing, really, to be honest with you. I mean, Rolling Stone was doing, one of these 20th anniversary, they were doing one of these anniversary issues, in this case for the 20th anniversary. And essentially the idea was to line up, all of, these kind of, franchise artists, all the people that Rolling Stone wrote about so much over the years, very much including, George Harrison and Paul McCartney. I remember very much like being at this meeting. I hadn't been on staff at Rolling Stone very long at that point, but the Beatles, you know, there was a sense of, you know, the Beatles obviously always were prominent and they always were very significant for the magazine. But I remember at that point where I was sitting in a meeting with, you know, all of these other writers, and as Jim Henke, you know, was very involved in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and passed away, I think, just within the last year. You know, Jim was just running down a list, and you know, you could sort of, you know, essentially ask for what you wanted, and I remember everyone, you know, it just goes, well, what about Paul McCartney? And like, there's like silence. So I said, well, I'd like to do Paul McCartney. There's, okay, great. Anthony will do Paul McCartney. And then I just said, well, what about George Harrison? Silence. And I just said, oh, well, I'd love to do George Harrison. I go, okay, great. You know, you can do George Harrison. Like, it was that, like, no one else was interested. You know, I mean, I think, you know, if, you know, John Lydon or somebody was going to be in the issue, like, I think people would have gotten a lot more excited. But I was happy, you know, and, you know, I wrote, you know, at that point, wrote like letters, you know, that were faxed to, you know, to McCartney, sort of explaining what we were doing. You know, I got, you know, his assistant called me up, and, you know, at you know, months in advance, you know, and just said, you know, Paul will, you know, be available to you on this date in June at this time, at his office in you know, in London. And it was just, like, there was no like, will that work for you? Is that a good time for you? It was just, you know, this is where he'll be and when he'll be there, you know, just come and show up. And it's okay, great. But, you know, at that point, you know, it had been a while since George Harrison made a record. It's been a while since he spoke with Rolling Stone. You know, there was, you know, as with so many artists, you know, there was a little bit of bad blood there. And so it took a really long time to just find him. I was calling everybody who knew him, who'd worked with him, you know. Through all this, I wound up breaking the news that he was working on Cloud 9. I mean, that had not been out there yet. And I got that news because his wife called me up.
Wow.
You know, she just called me up like one day and just said, you know, you've been very persistent in trying to get in touch with George. You know, we're just wondering, you know, what's up. And she was very friendly, you know, and then she said, you know, George is working on a new album and this is what he's doing and blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, okay, great. You know, I'm coming to London to talk to Paul, you know, on this date. And, you know, obviously we'd love to have George in this issue. And she said, oh, okay, you know, let me talk to George, you know, and blah, blah, blah. So, you know, I go to London. He still hasn't agreed. Essentially, the magazine just said, you know, stay there, you know, until he says yes or no, you know. And so, you know, I was just checking in with Olivia Harrison, you know, like just at, you know, I'm in London. Okay, I talked to Paul. I'm done. You know, I'm still here. And you know, she just said, well, I'll talk to you tomorrow morning, you know, just, you know, she knew, you know, what hotel I was staying at. And, you know, I was in this London hotel room that was tiny. You know, this is before cell phones or anything. And I didn't want to miss her call. So I remember like dragging the phone, like whatever its wire was, like across the room so that I could take a shower, so that I would still hear the phone if it rang, if she called me. And, you know, she did call and she just said, well, you know, if you're free this afternoon, George has a couple of hours if you'd like to come out. You know, I said, great, you know, let's do that. And, you know, I got the directions, you know, to take the train out there. George was like, was shocked that like Rolling Stone, you know, didn't spring for a car to drive me out there. It's like clearly.
And this was Friar Park, right?
Yeah,
His home in
Henley on Thames. It's like going out to Scarsdale or something. This very sort of leafy suburb, you know, and but you know, yeah, nobody Rolling Stone mentioned, oh yeah, we'll get a car service for you, you know, or anything like that. It was,
Well, just the whole, like the way that you connected through Olivia, that's one thing that really struck me about your interview, Anthony, too, was that the part where he starts talking about the way he connected with Jeff Lynne and like, oh, well, I didn't really know if Jeff would want to work with me on this record. And finally I asked Dave Edmunds if Dave Edmunds would introduce us. I mean, you know, in this day and age of like my person will talk to your person and me, you know, and the fact that this was just such a, you know, just human connecting with George through Olivia, he through Dave Edmunds with Jeff. Did that same kind of personality come across in his bearings with you? You met him?
I mean, the last thing in this, you know, obviously it's a long story that I've dined out on many times, but you know, I took the train out to Henley, and they had said, you know, and I was calling, you know, I'd been to London, I mean, a bunch of times for Rolling Stone, but I'm trying to figure out how to use the change and the phone and the number and who's gonna, you know, answer. And so I'm at the station, and she, you know, when I talked to Olivia, she said someone will come and pick you up, and you know, there was nobody there, and you know, it was like arriving again at this nice suburban station on a Saturday afternoon. You know, everybody's off with their families or off to do whatever, and there's nobody around. And so I start fiddling with the change to find the phone to go and call her again and see what's what. And then I just hear, you know, this voice just says, oh, well, you know, you look like you might be here from New York. And I turned around, and there's George Harrison. Like, he had
oh
come
my God,
to the train station to pick me up. And, you know, we got into this, you know, sports car of his. And he goes, and this was just like, the whole thing was just surreal. But like, you know, he just said, he goes, oh, you know, so I understand you spoke to Paul yesterday. How is he doing? And I thought, like, man, like, this is like what the Beatles have come to, is George Harrison asking me, like, how is Paul McCartney doing? And I explained, you know, the McCartney interview, you know, Paul was talking a lot, and, you know, I wasn't getting a huge amount of time. I had about, you know, maybe an hour and a half or something. And, you know, after a while, I thought, you know, I have to really take hold of this interview. I've got to get a grip on it. And I told George that. And George just kind of looked over at me like, well, that's what it was like, you know. I mean, he and McCartney, yeah, there was, I mean, to say there was tension between them would be, you know, I'm sure everyone has seen the scene in Let It Be where they're kind of sparring, and, you know, so there was this kind of sense of, you know, God. I mean, and, you know, we went to Henley, we went to this guest house. Olivia brought out cookies, American cookies, she took care to say. And, you know, we just sat there and, you know, talked for a couple of hours. And it was the one time I made up this little mantra for, like, you know, obviously, you know, there were many, many artists I really admire that I talked to, but a lot of them, you know, were people, like, I was a full-grown person. You know, by the time I came to their music. But with the Beatles, you know, I was a kid, you know, and they are a big reason why I do what I do and care about what I care about. And so I would just be staring at George, like we sit at this table, and all these images are running through my head. And I finally, like, literally said to myself at one point, like, he stopped talking, you have to say something. Like, I had no idea what he had just said, you know, like, I just, you know, you've got to get in there and, like, do your job. And then I made up this little mantra for myself, which was get excited later, like, do this thing, like, get this job done. And you know, then when it comes out in the magazine and everybody gets excited, you can get excited too, but, like, you've got to get a grip on yourself, man. So that's what it was like, you know. I mean, it was
George, like, felt had something to prove? I mean, or was it more just kind of a relaxed conversation? Was he still pissed off about, you know, the 74 bad review he got?
You know, he mentioned it, you know, it did come up. You know, the Rolling Stone, you know, apparently deservedly, you know, gave, you know, what wasn't too kind to him about his 74 tour. Now it's 15 years later or whatever it was, 13 years later. But but there wasn't anything to prove. There wasn't. It was really, he just literally. I mean, he was smoking at the time. I was smoking. He just threw down a pack of Marlboros and just said, "Yeah, so what would you like to know?" It's just like that, and he was willing to go wherever I wanted to go. It was a retrospective interview, which was great in that it wasn't about, so what was the third track on your new album like? It was, just about being in the Beatles and what that was all about, and which he had complicated feelings about, of course.
Wow.
Which was one of the ironies, and I've been yakking away here, but like of watching that, Hall of Fame footage of that night, and there was just such an irony that he would be up there representing the Beatles, when he, obviously John had his own ambivalences, but George's were very, very deep. And, it was kind of, impressive that he would show up and try to carry forward whatever it was that it meant at that point.
Yeah,
Now,
Ringo kind of treated it as a open mic night, but it's George who went deep,
Yeah, just you could just see the things that were running through his mind,
right,
as you looked at him there.
So now let's move over to Mark, who's next to me on the Hollywood Squares of my screen. But Mark, he was at a very different place when you got to interview him in '89. Cloud 9 had come out and been, quite well received, even had a couple of hits. We had the whole traveling Wilburys thing. And where was he in his life when you spoke to him? And you actually had the nerve to bring up what it was like to be kind of in the shadow of Lennon McCartney and trying to come out as a songwriter and really try to draw him out to discuss that with you, which was great that you were able to do that with him.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, well, I have to say, I didn't have to go through a lot of the rigmarole Anthony did because they set up the interview at Warner Brothers. So I think they had him trapped there. And so I all I had to do was find my way over to Burbank. But, also like what Anthony says, when you grow up with an artist that you admired, worshipped, adored, whatever, with the Beatles, there's pretty big turf there. And you think of them as this like amazing elder in a way, even though in retrospect, you realize, oh, he was like 10 years older than me and quite a bit older. And I'm quite a bit older than he was then, now. But I think he was, even though only a couple of years had elapsed since Anthony's interview, I think he was in probably a considerably happier place, mostly because of the Wilburys. There was also the fact that they finally finished the endless legal battling that had been going on amongst the Beatles for decades, really. They'd finally come to this place where they'd made a settlement. He was relieved, I think, deeply about that. And we ended up, kind of talking, well, what's in the vault, because at that point, we'd all had these sort of bootleg cassettes of a lot of the songs that ended up on the Beatles Chronicles, but they were very much like underground rumors, didn't really know how much stuff was really there. So I think at that point, it was just kind of probing. But the Wilburys, I think, gave him the alternative Beatles life that he had sort of missed, In other words, he was in a band of musicians that were kind of just as great, but it was fun, it was lighthearted, and it was a band of equals. It wasn't the problem that always kind of kept going on with him and Paul, and which he certainly mentioned many times, was really like, he obviously admired and respected Paul a lot for his musical abilities, but he really had to kind of like shove his shoe in the door every time he wanted to get a song done, and I think the quote he made to somebody was, he'd get Paul to do one song if he would work on 59 of Paul's, So I think that was, understandably a little tiresome, and especially because as we all came to see, he was really blooming as a songwriter late in the Beatles' career together, and that he really came on right after that. And but he never, that was it for being in a band up until this kind of wonderful accidental Wilburys experience. And so he was I think he was in a good mood, you know. I mean, I didn't know what to expect. They put us in a little windowless room, you know. But as soon as he came in, I felt, you know, actually, I could be very comfortable with this guy. He was so sort of straightforward. And if you ask something a little silly, you know, you'd kind of get it with a look, you know, or a quick comment. But he wasn't hostile at all, you know. He was a very generous minded person. I think that that was reflected through his spirituality, and his spirituality helped bring that out of him as time went on as well. So it was a lot of fun, and there wasn't an agenda, kind of like what Anthony was saying with him. You know, they were putting out the best of Dark Horse, so there was one extra song on there, Cockamamie Business, and maybe something else, or maybe I'm getting the songs confused, but there wasn't a big agenda there. It was sort of like, he's up for doing an interview, and happily I was the only musician editor who lived in LA, so I got the gig, you know. And so you know, it was great, because then we could go on and talk about the Beatles. We could let the thing wander. We could go solo career. We talk about handmade films, you know, where again, I think, you know, he really loved to take the piss out of himself and the band, really, more than anything. You know, he just really didn't like standing on any kind of pretense. And I think my favorite line from the interview was, I'd noticed how he was always constantly kind of diminishing, in a way, his ability as a guitar player. And I think I do understand now how he would say, if he had not gone in all these other directions, if he had just devoted himself to guitar, he probably could have been a more technically proficient guitarist. But to me, he was actually, you know, he had a voice, and that's what really matters as a musician. And I said, you know, you seem to always put yourself down as a guitarist, and he said, I'm not putting myself down. I'm just not putting myself up.
Yeah.
And I thought that was George Harrison right there.
I thought, Mark, your discussion of his playing was actually really kind of insightful and helpful to me in terms of just understanding it. Like, you know, you're talking about how he almost composed these parts, you know, and you know, there really is an element of that, to that sound that, you know, you don't, I mean, I'm not a musician myself, so I don't particularly think that way, but it made so much sense when I you know, read your take on it, and just want to mention.
Thanks. You know, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it was in your interview, Mark, where he said something to the effect of, yeah, if the Beatles hadn't gotten so famous, we could have been a really good band.
Yeah,
something like
and
that.
I think that shows how serious he was as a musician. Actually, he had standards, you know, and actually, I'm going to name drop somebody else here that connects to Ashley in a way, which was, you know, I got to interview Miles Davis once, and you know, really, obviously, that was also kind of a cosmic experience. But later, you know, I read a comment about Miles by Bill Evans, where he theorized that Miles, not really being a true virtuoso or having a natural virtuosic kind of abilities the way some musicians did, like John Coltrane, had to work harder at really developing his craft and his voice. And in his opinion, those are the ones that in many ways become the better musicians, because they really have to work at it. It takes them longer, but a real voice emerges. And I think that works for George. I don't think that George had the natural affinity for just playing that Paul McCartney had, you know what I mean? But he worked at it. When he was in that early rockabilly phase, he just worked and worked until every one of those notes and the tone like really shone, you know? And then eventually, obviously, you know, I think what was great was that ultimately his spirituality led him to develop and expand his own idea of what he'd like to write about. And that's when I think as a songwriter, he really came into his own.
I wanted to just add, you know, this whole idea of the Wilburys and, you know, some of the remarks that Mark was making about them, I think, you know, is in line with a kind of psychological, you know, sort of impulse that was within George, which was to find ways of like gaining recognition outside the Beatles, like, you know, his friendship with Eric Clapton, his friendship with Bob Dylan,
Ravi Shankar.
Ravi Shankar, of course, yeah, which was in many ways a bigger thing than that, but still similar. You know, that somehow almost like, because the Beatles shook him up so much, he was the youngest one, and he, said, it just wrecked my nervous system. I think that, like, in the way that, Lennon had his own take on it, Ringo kind of floated through it, Paul loved it. And, but George, I think, was just kind of really, shook by the whole thing. Like, when I was talking to him once, he was describing just this thing of like what Beatlemania looked like to him, which was, we're flying into the airport and kids are running on the tarmac. We're at a concert and, somebody sets off fireworks and we're looking around to see, like, did anything happen? Were there any shots fired? This element of that somehow, that we go to the Philippines and, there's riots because of, the Marcoses. And, that's what that all looked like to him, like it was frightening to him. And
yeah.
Plus, he also didn't have that stature that Paul and John had. And so I think, finding an exit in terms of his relationships with these other, artists and cultural figures, I think was helpful to him. It gave him confidence and direction, in a way that the Beatles, only did to a degree.
Ollie, I was just going to jump in and say, one of the things that came out of doing this book was the realization that the Beatles existed, or the divorce of the Beatles took longer than it took for the Beatles to establish themselves. And then finally, the 10 years of the Beatles was shorter than the divorce of the Beatles. And that's one measure of the impact that this group incredibly had. That really comes out of having worked on this book, and kind of echoes what Anthony was just saying. And one of my favorite terms, one of my favorite little lines in the whole book is how Mark Rowland described it, which was the long and winding agreement, that they had to reach by the late 80s, as far as the dissolution of Apple Corp, which really kind of was the corporate reflection of that idyllic Beatles optimism of the 60s, of what they were trying to do. And the other realization that, I put in the preface of this book is that this mission, this idea of social role of music, and the idea of the mobilizing effect of rock coming out of the 60s, that became Apple Corp, that the one Beatle who took this mission forward and extended, his fame and fortune in the direction of like all these different projects, multimedia stuff, was George, more than the other Beatles. John, because we lost him in 1980, but George with Handmade Films, with Dark Horse Records, with his collaborations with other artists, of course, Ravi Shankar, Billy Preston, and then, the Wilburys, is all kind of indicative of that original Apple mission, that the Beatles were about. But it was George who, kind of found that balance between having to be the businessman, which he hated. He hated the concept of looking at contracts and whatnot, but he spent his life doing that. He had no choice. And then making music or going home and gardening at Friar Park.
Yeah, I think it was in the interview with Mark, he was talking about having to do all the business aspects of the Wilburys, all that stuff. And then I think also he was still talking about, and I'd like to touch on the concert for Bangladesh, about dealing with all the, with that concert, trying to make the right choice as far as how to distribute all the income for that, and how it took a long time to actually get millions of dollars from album sales, et cetera, to finally get that money to the people it was intended for. Can you talk a little bit, Ashley, about that social consciousness and how he kind of took the lead really was the first rock. Of course, we had folk musicians in the 60s coming together for a cause, but I think you could say George really did the first well-known concert for a cause in rock that would then, you know, we'd have much later on things like Farm Aid and Live Aid, of course, and things
Yeah.
like that.
No,
Can
I'd
we
be happy
talk
to.
a
I
little bit
mean,
about that?
you know, I think that George was very aware. In fact, I know George was very aware of the idea of protest and social, you know, activism through music. You know, Nina Simone and Sam Cooke and you know, and yeah, the Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan, of course, his close friend. You know, but that was sort of coming through the music, the idea of creating events and using the power of rock. You know, the sort of far reach and the you know the mountain of attention that rock was getting by the end of the 60s. That really was what his innovation was turning that huge machine to the idea of, like I said, mobilization and social awareness and focusing on a moment. And the moment that he decides to focus on is, of course, the outbreak of civil war in Bangladesh, which was tearing that country apart. It was the home country of Ravi Shankar, so it was very personal. It was very much because of Ravi's roots that he decides to step in. But what I found interesting, and I didn't realize this till I really got deep into these interviews, is that the initial request, that first ask from Ravi, was simply for a check for like 30 or 40 grand to help out some families over there. And it was John Lennon's kind of tutelage with George during the Beatles years of, if you're going to do something, go for the mountaintop, go big. And because of that kind of inspiration from John, George says, well, let me take this idea of supporting the Bangladesh situation and doing what we can as far as that goes, to do not one concert, but two concerts, not just a concert, but an all-star concert. Let's record it. Let's film it. Let's put it out as an album. And then, let's be very public with all the battles that I'm going through. So his battle with Bhaskar Menon, who's the head of EMI, to get the album out. And then with Alan Klein, he's very open and very authentic and very honest and emotional about the battles that he was going through, just to, get the money back so he could give it to where it was supposed to go.
Anthony, you were in New York at that time. By any wild chance, did you go to the concert at Madison Square Garden?
Not go to that concert, unfortunately. No, obviously it was a huge, big deal. Obviously, in Bangladesh is back in the news, these days. I mean, one of the interesting things about, George and, the kind of social consciousness element is, I think like a lot of, like his good friend Eric Clapton and others, there was a strong sort of conservative streak in him that I sensed. I mean, as much time as I had with him, it wasn't something I could really sort of dive into at that point. But there was a kind of sense at that time that I was talking to him in '87, he was not crazy about what had happened with punk and what all that represented. Just a few passing remarks, just kind of demonstrated that, there was an element of, I think the Bangladesh thing was primarily for Ravi Shankar, and it was a humanitarian rather than, than a political thing. And certainly George had very, very strong feelings about the environment. That was something that was, on his mind. But, he wasn't somebody who was out there in a political way. I think, it crossed over into spiritualism, which Lenin would make fun of, like later, that it was, George is living in some some, you know, la-di-da world of, you know, just kind of these spiritual abstractions. You know, I was Lenin being nasty, but nonetheless, you know, I mean, it wasn't like, you know, he was like living and dying with, you know, like various political movements of that time when, you know, I think other artists were really kind of struggling with that, and, you know, a lot of them in England.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the idea of his political consciousness is more complicated than we sometimes think it is. Now, the impact and the way people used what Bangladesh was undeniably important. You know, I mean, that was very, very important.
Okay.
But, you know, I think how he got into it and what it sort of meant to him is another, you know, is, you know, more complex than that, I think.
Right. And
Well,
I think in your conversation, he still referenced back to that, but then he was talking very much about his concerns about food, protecting food and preventing the agribusiness. I mean, which is still, it's turned into the monster here. And then the environment and things, those kind of issues. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think what George is, his politics were filtered through a kind of practical idealism, I think. You know, he definitely aspired toward a better world, but it was more like seeing a problem and identifying it and then wanting to figure out a way to be part of the solution rather than wrapping it all up in a political ideology or gestalt that he would then verbalize or articulate. You know, but I think that the proof is in the pudding, you know, with George. I mean, he put his money and he put his time and he put his effort where his heart was. And in our conversation, he actually took some turn that I had made about a song or something, and just turned it right into his feelings about what was going on with the environment, and then actually just said it. You know, he said, "You see how I just turned the page here," and it was like, okay, fine, let's talk about that sort of thing. You know, I think that he, you know, I mean, the concept of Bangladesh, I think it's hard to see really appreciate in retrospect how difficult that must have been just to organize it. You know, and I think that his, you know, they already at that point, he commanded, by dint of what it was about, a certain moral stature so that artists wanted to be there. I mean, even, sure, he was already friendly with Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton, but those guys are not easy guys to wrestle into showing up at a benefit concert, you know, and you know, I think it was a little touch and go in both cases, whether they'd actually even be there or not. But I think it says a lot about George that they did, you know, and
the thing, I mean, with Dylan, I mean, in one of the conversations, you know, the interviews I did with George, you know, when he was talking about trying to get Dylan to do it, and, you know, like, and Dylan said to him, well, you know, it's not my scene. And like Harrison said, like, look, man, it's not my scene either, you know, like, but I've never been out there. You've at least done it. Like, I've never been the front guy, you know, I've never been out there that way, like at Madison Square Garden or whatever, you know, like on my own, you know.
Wasn't Bangladesh the first time that he really stepped out publicly after his motorcycle accident?
And Dylan, well, no, there was one other thing. Is that true? Let me just get the timeline right. Well, since the motorcycle, well, yeah, I guess it is, you know, I guess it is.
Yeah, because the reunion tour with the band wasn't until 74.
Yeah, it was certainly his biggest step out since then, I think.
Yeah.
So he'd been off of the live scene, whereas the rock explosion had taken place.
Yeah.
He was upstate New York, you know.
Exactly.
You know, there was something that I remember Dylan saying once. He was asked about you know, his politics and how he wrote a lot of songs that were political, quote unquote, back in the early days, said the interviewer. And Dylan's response was kind of like, well, I was never really that interested in politics. I was interested in justice. And, you know, when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, you know, I kind of see that is actually where you're coming from. It's a through line. I think, you know, George and Bob obviously had a lot in common and got along so well. I kind of think that's where George was at too. He was looking at justice, and in the interview that I did do with him, you know, he made very sharp comments about essentially political leaders. You know, you can't trust them. You know, they're not going to get it done. like we have to get it done, which of course is a comment that continues to ring true through time. But I think he saw it as like, and since they're not going to get it done and we have to get it done, I'm going to do my part. And, you know, I think he helped transform the whole image of musicians from sort of lovable rogues, you know, and you know, and Peter Pan-ish sort of children, you know, who got to live their dream, into actually, gee, these are actually the responsible adults that are helping to point us toward doing something about causes that we might otherwise be completely unaware of, which was certainly in the case of Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Actually,
You know,
I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of these ideas are actually reflected in his songs and his music.
Yeah. Oh, well, before I get to that, I just want to say that one of the things that really impresses me a lot about Mark's and Anthony's interview with George. I mean, you know, this is part of what we do. You know, you prepare for an interview, but your understanding of his spirituality, of his Vedic, you know, a very specific way of thinking about spirituality and that path. And of course, his involvement with the Hare Krishna movement and what Sri Prabhupada was teaching obviously reflects on his sense of politics too, because if your deepest spiritual belief is based on a 25,000 year cycle that the world is going through, and you're thinking of this extremely, you know, looking at the world through a really long lens, you know, it's going to be, you're going to look at politics differently, because all the stuff that's going on looks like, you know, mini blips on the radar, you know, and that George really believed that and really looked at, you know, the world that way through a spiritual lens. And yet at the same time, his feet were on the ground, you know, so you can hear him bristling at the way that the environment is being treated in Mark Rowland's interview, you know, and so once again, hats off to both of you guys for, you know, doing such a great preparation, but really understanding and being able to engage with George so that he goes deep and he goes, you know, into the areas that I don't think many other music journalists of the day, even by the 80s, would have been able to kind of meet him on that level, you know.
Well, I was going to say, I do think there is a way in which, you know, when George talks about his own kind of spiritual feelings and concerns, you actually, you know, you're actually he does it in a way that makes you want to listen. It doesn't, you know, that's not an easy subject to kind of, you know, it's easy to quote, no pun intended, pontificate on. And I think for most of us journalists, the inclination is to kind of almost put it to the side, like, well, nobody's going to really want to hear about this so much, you know. But with George, he made it, you know, he wasn't abashed and he wasn't embarrassed. He certainly wasn't afraid of being mocked for it or anything like that. He put it out, you know, without going overboard. It was there. And then if you asked a question about that would touch on it, he would bring it up. But he was, I think he was pretty clear-headed about how to be spiritual, if that makes any sense. And I think he you know, it was a practice for him. You know, it wasn't just, it started as practice like a guitar and it became a practice. And I found it, you know, I've come to be kind of inspired by it, just reading this book and seeing how often it comes up, and obviously in greater depth with some of the interviews, like Mukunda, I guess, you know, who was actually writing and interviewing him specifically about it.
Yeah.
Hey, y'all, we should probably open this up for questions a little bit too.
Yeah. And Ashley, do you want to wrap up just with some thoughts?
Sure. I mean, you know, I kind of get your point about, you know, the power of George's beliefs and his intentions through his music is kind of proven today by the fact that, you know, the #1 streamed Beatles song, when people need that shot of, you know, Beatles optimism, Beatles spirit, is "Here Comes the Sun." It's been the #1 streamed song of all the Beatles catalog for the last 3-4 years. And especially now, it's one of the go-to songs that hospitals are playing when COVID survivors are discharged, and there's been news reports on that too this year in 2020. So, I think George would be smiling at that, knowing that, and probably chafing at the bit to talk about, what's going on politically and health-wise, etc. He was very focused on the idea of health and the environment too. And so, we're kind of living his nightmare right now.
Yes. So I think we do have quite a few questions. I think Kimberly, are you going to take over and handle
Yes.
the questions for us so people can direct them to, Ashley, Mark, and Anthony, or specifically?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so Chris Malamphy has a question, and Chris, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks. This is a great panel. What I sort of have on the brain these days about George, I consider myself a medium level Beatles obsessive. I'm not that wacko, but I'm sort of this level of wacko, and I follow some amount of Beatle podcasts and Beatle fan lore. And I was recently listening to one of the maybe 2 Beatles podcasts I listen to regularly. They were walking through the story of how the anthology in the 90s came to be. And the lore among Beatle fans is, to cut to the chase, if George didn't need the money, it would never have happened. That basically Paul wanted it for something in the matter of decades. And the connection, the crazy connection, and this is what fascinates me about what you all are talking about with these 1987 interviews in particular. 87 is like, George coming back after a 5-year hiatus between albums with Cloud9, and he's being reflective about the Beatles, but he's probably pretty stressed because he's also just had, correct me if I'm wrong, the Madonna Shanghai surprise fiasco, which helped to bankrupt him. So I'm wondering if that stress in 87 is starting to show on George, like he's coming back partially because it feels like it's time to produce some material again, and partially because he's like, wow, I'm bleeding red ink right now, which we know where that goes in the 90s, I guess.
I didn't, it certainly wasn't something he brought up.
Sure.
And I certainly didn't get that. I mean, look, he's driving me in a car that probably cost $150,000. We're going to this house that just looked like a fairy tale mansion, and we're in the guest house, which is, quite nice. You didn't have a sense of, this is somebody who is struggling, but, look, these things are relative. It may have been in the back of his mind. I got the sense that, right around that time was when, it seemed like, CDs were really beginning to make their sort of impact, and there was like a kind of renewed focus on, musicians of that generation. And I think there was a kind of sense of, well, why not try? But, that doesn't mean that, he wasn't sitting around with, somebody who was telling him, like, look, it really wouldn't hurt for you to have, a record that, that did something.
Yeah.
But I didn't get that sense that,
I would think Ringo would have needed the money a little more than George, considering the way songwriting royalties work. But to the point that you were making before, my understanding about Shanghai Surprise, although it was a critical bomb, ultimately through the distributing that was done, it kind of ended up sort of breaking even, but it gave I think it's in one of the interviews actually in the book with somebody else. He talks about it in some detail and says that it was a wake-up moment and a scary moment of, we better not get involved with any more of these big films because it could end up being the end of us,
Yeah.
But that they actually kind of survived that particular one. And of course it was a one-off compared to what most of Handmade films were, which were these small films that had a little more of a sensibility that that actually seem to have a lot to do with George and his kind of humor and humanism.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that period is like the 10-year anniversary of handmade films, and it's already proven itself as next to, you know, I think only Merchant Ivory had as big an effect on the indie UK cinema scene of that period, but movies like With Nail and I and whatnot absolutely had created a critical reputation for handmade and enough money that they could actually suffer through Shanghai Surprise, you know. But in the end, I think, you know, any publicity is good publicity, and so the fiasco, especially with having a young Madonna and Sean Penn involved with it, actually was to their advantage, you know, and they didn't go down that line again. But what happened was that George's relationship with his manager, who was also his the co-director of Handmade Films, Dennis O'Brien, started to unravel, and George started to see what was going on financially, and much as he did with Alan Klein, he eventually, you know, split with Dennis, and that was a problem. But I believe the anthology series, especially because of Derek Taylor's involvement, I mean, he was kind of in the driver's seat with the anthology series, and Derek Taylor, of course, was the old press agent for the Beatles back in '63 and '64, and that relationship was very warm and positive. And I think George would have been involved with that because in Mark's interview, he talks about other people stepping up and wanting to control the Beatles kind of story and how it's being fashioned. There was a really terrible Beatles kind of multi-series documentary that had come out, you know, in England called The Beatles Chronicles, I think. Am I right, Mark?
Or the Complete Beatles?
The Complete Beatles. And he hated that. And, you know, he liked the Ruddles, which was the parody band, you know, more than he did that. But he talks about wanting to kind of wrest control and having the Beatles tell their own story. And I think he actually would have been okay with that, the anthology stuff.
Thank you.
I think he was. Great question.
Okay, Franklin Bruno has a question. You're still muted.
Yeah. I just wanted to know what the sort of proportion of interviews where he gets into the weeds on technique, whether that means guitar playing or how songs were written or how he contributed to them or studio. Because Paul McCartney, I get the sense he'll talk about that stuff at the drop of the hat, and many musicians are quite reluctant. So I was wondering what sort of interviews he does that in, or if you get a sense of how comfortable he was articulating that sort of thing.
Thanks for bringing this up, Franklin. I'm actually going to share something with you that this broke my heart that I wasn't able to include it because the Harrison estate said, no, we need that for our book. And it's a letter to Stuart Sutcliffe in 1961. And it's just after the Beatles have been kicked out of Hamburg because they don't have work permits for the first time that they're there. And Stuart Sutcliffe stays behind because he's fallen in love, and he will soon, you know, pass away from a brain hemorrhage. But it's a letter from George to Stuart trying to get him to come back to Liverpool, and he's talking about all this new guitar, paraphernalia that's come out, like little echo pedals, and we're finally getting some American guitars in the guitar shop here. And by the way, Paul can't play bass; he's not really good. But I would say that in various interviews, there's stuff buried in there that describes technique. In Mark's interview, for example, he talks specifically of where he was when he came up for the guitar line to I Feel Fine, and where it comes from, the blues tune.
Back to Bobby Parker, actually.
Bobby Parker,
yeah,
and he gives Bobby Parker full credit, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the song.
So it's kind of buried, it's woven in there, but there's no like a guitar player magazine interview with him that I could find.
I think I feel like I've seen him credit Larry Williams, Tony Maroney, or something for guitar parts too, right?
He mentions Larry Williams in Mark, so everybody's
okay.
talking about Mark's interview. Maybe Mark could say something too, but yes, he brings up Larry Williams in.
But you know, you know, Mark was saying, you know, he was so down on his own playing, and you have the guitar parts just on Abbey Road, you know, just on the end, that little part that he plays at the very end. It is, I can't imagine that tune being anywhere close to the diamond jewel that it is without that guitar part. And he would come up with it in the moment in the studio, add it in, and boom, it was done. You know, so it's like I said, it's
in the song. You know, I mean, that was his. You know, he wasn't. You know, he wasn't a guitar slinger. You know, he wasn't that guy.
Right.
He was in the song. You know, he would come up with the part. You know, and so there's that kind of blending into the context is one of his great gifts, I think.
You know? Yeah.
But he wasn't. He was quiet on that, I have to say. You know.
Yeah, he didn't. I mean, I didn't get the sense that he really wanted to get too technical, because he would almost kind of toss it off like, you know, again, he kind of diminished. Like, I could have spent all this time learning how to play, but you know, more or better. But look at B.B. King; he plays the same 4 notes, and it's fantastic. So you know, and he's doing that. So why do I have to do that? You know, that would often be his kind of response. You know, I bet if someone had really come with a more focused, we're just going to talk about you and how you get a tone out of Rickenbacker, he probably would have gone there, you know, because it certainly was a great love of his. And that's what got him going. It's what got him off the dime.
And when he needed a great part, you know, he could call Eric, you know, so.
That's kind of what he would say, yeah.
Okay. Nicolette Rohr, I believe, has a question.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing these stories. I'm just kind of curious, with the time that you've spent looking at this collection over time. We kind of talked about these like different phases of the Beatles, and you kind of see like the reluctance during and the like kind of malaise and like I can't even talk about this right afterwards. And so I'm just curious, kind of on the other side of what we call 90s Beatles, I guess. Those are my Beatles, the Beatles that I first met in the 90s during the anthology era and everything that went with that. You know, I know George Harrison didn't live much longer after that, but do you see kind of any shift in his attitude towards the Beatles, or what he was willing to share about the Beatle years, I guess, sort of during or on the other side of that, the anthology year? Like that, since you spent so much time with his words, I'm just curious on your take.
Well, Ashley, maybe that one is for you, although of course I have some ideas.
Well, that he does in East St. Louis, you know, is very different from the way he was looking back at it in the 90s. And I was very scared at a certain point that the book was going to like repeat itself a lot, and that he'd be telling the same anecdotes, you know, over and over and over. And I was so amazed to see that he really honestly reflected where he was in his timeline, and his attitude about the Beatles absolutely changed. And it's just like you describe it, you know, when he was in the middle of that late 70s, mid 80s legal wrangling, you know, with Paul especially, you know, he didn't want to be bothered. He didn't want to talk about it. But, you know, by the 90s, he's really thinking back on it in a kind of dispassionate way. And he's achieved that distance. And he's proud of it. He's never not proud of it, of what they accomplished. You know, all the ancillary craziness and whatnot, you know, he could have done without. But he was very proud of the music. And, you know, What you see in the interviews, especially when the interviewers are, on target with being able to reference, his first stepping out as a songwriter, etc. He's very comfortable talking about it. The further away from the '60s he gets.
Yeah, I would say something. There's one thing in one of the books where he, one of the interviews, I think it's with Mick Brown, where he's kind of saying in the '60s, we were the only 4 people who didn't get to hear the Beatles. We had to kind of do it, so we didn't get the glow that everybody else is talking about.
And that's from 1979, Rolling Stone.
Yes, but I think we can now see, looking back, that there is part of what made them so fantastic and magical was there was this innate, positive, spiritual quality to the music that just starts with "Please, Please Me" and just keeps going, And I think I'm going to conjecture that as George got to look back on it more and more and more, it aligned with what his own ideals would be about what music should be and could be. It could be a force for positive change. And certainly, it's almost inarguable that the Beatles provided that. And I'm going to guess that had to be somewhat satisfying and gratifying to him in the later stages of his life.
Well, I was growing up around that time. I was a teenager, certainly. I was in New York when the Beatles got here and all this. And I remember asking Harrison about it, just saying, like, look, we were looking to you guys, in the way that we did in those days with records, like a new Beatles record was like was like something that had to be plumbed for, any kind of meaning or direction, for our lives, not just that's a great song or whatever. And one of the things he said that was so interesting, he goes, well, there was so much going on then, because I felt like we were just getting swept along too. Like we were just getting swept along with it. I didn't necessarily feel like our central role in it. It was, we were responding to everything that was happening around us as well. And I thought, like, that was pretty amazing, because it, there was a kind of sense of them as almost being outside of it. But, hey, it's history and everybody who's living is living within it. And, he seemed aware of that, I get what you're saying about you're listening to us, but we were just feeling everything else and trying to respond to it and create from it. It was intriguing.
Hey, Anthony.
Yeah.
Remember what he says to you about taking Danny, his son, to Prince's Trust? What can you share that?
Yeah, like he was talking about, like, in that way of kids, that like he didn't have like his son Danny wasn't like the sense of like my father's a Beatle or something like this, and he was like listening to Chuck Berry or Cab Calloway or this kind of stuff. And so, at the Prince's Trust, like there was a kind of sense of seeing his dad up there and also like connecting him to those figures that were important to him as a kid. One time, I interviewed Jacob Dylan a few times, and one time he really talked a lot about his dad. And one of the things he said was, if you were to go to my father's house, like, you would know he was a musician. Like there's records and there's instruments around, and but like there's no like gold records. There's no, like, you wouldn't have a sense if he had a record out that year. You wouldn't know if it was a good year for him, if he was on tour, if it was a bad year. And I sort of get that sense about like the way sort of Harrison lived as well. That he wasn't like pointing out to Danny like his picture in history books. It was just, you like Chuck Berry or you like Cab Calloway, like let's listen to that. And he allowed his son to come to it, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it eventually made a bigger impact on his son.
I think one of the strangest things about the book is realizing that after that, terrible 1975, terrible experience, not musically, but his 1974 tour was the last time George ever really toured. He toured with Eric Clapton in Japan once, in the 90s, but he wasn't touring. So Danny didn't experience his father as a performing musician at all. And so discovering the Beatles, was kind of through his parents' record collection, much like us, And when he finally got to go to this Prince's Trust performance, and of course he has to do, and Eric's there, so he's going to do While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and he does Here Comes the Sun. And he asked, Danny's about 10 years old at this point, and, Anthony's talking to Anthony, and he says, Danny, what did you think? Did you enjoy it? He goes, yeah, but why didn't you do some of those Beatles tunes like, Roll Over Beethoven? So, George, I think, like I said, he had a different sort of disengaged view of the Beatles by then, so much so that his own son really had to kind of discover the Beatles on his own.
I want to just make a point about the book, and a remark that Ashley made earlier, which was, that Harrison talked a lot over the years. I mean, he really didn't. I mean, I think, there's so much now around, like when I wrote my Lou Reed book, I thought, well, this will be easy kind of, because Lou didn't do that many interviews. Well, now you can find every single interview he did in Sweden or whatever, and so there's more than you think. But Ashley is such a good, such a good sleuth that, you're in the book, there are these, radio interviews and interviews with like these small newspapers or, whatever, that is really, I think, one of the most fascinating things about the book. Look, we all love, in a big magazine or, a big outlet, the interview where you sit down, the serious chat, but these other things, often you find the person in a much more, in a much different frame of mind. And that, I think, really adds a kind of texture to the book that you just don't find in other books on a figure like George Harrison.
I want to jump in and say that, my favorite oddity in this book, which is full of just really kind of wonderful little surprises, is this BBC interview of let's just sit around and listen to some new records and talk about them with George Harrison and Michael Jackson. Somehow the cosmos has aligned in 1979, 3 months before Off the Wall comes out, when Michael Jackson's on tour with his family, with the Jacksons, and he's agreed to do this. And he is still, he is kind of probably at the peak of regular person normalcy that will exist in his life, And so he's just down there talking, and they go back and forth. And it's fascinating that they both do the same thing. There's a lot of clearly stuff that strikes them both as mediocre that's being played. And yet each of them will find something that they like in the song, and it'll be kind of technical musically. Michael Jackson will go, I really like the way the rhythm guitar played over the second chorus of that song, I mean, you can see that they're both big ear. They both have big ears, And it's funny that they clearly had just met for the first time, but they were both guys that basically had to get out of their family band to make it on their own and write their own music, So they did actually have a funny connection. And Michael Jackson was actually saying, so how did you guys get to do your own songs right from the start? The short answer would be we weren't signed to Motown, but but he had this kind of genuine wonder about it. And it was just kind of a wild, wonderful moment, that almost seemed made up, but it was real. And kudos to Ashley for coming up with that one.
Hey, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. That was great. It was a wonderful, wonderful panel. I want to thank Ashley and Holly and Anthony and Mark. And please join us next week as we welcome Alex Ross, who will discuss his forthcoming book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. And we hope to see you all next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.